Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you this meeting. I think it's an interesting junction, and I must say I very much enjoyed every presentation that I've seen. So I'll be talking to you today on these relations. That's my background, the legacy that I have, which may or may not influence me. I try to think it doesn't. I want to tell you a little bit about the summaries that I may come to in the end, because there are a number, and it may well be that you want to look at them and think about any questions meanwhile. So we want to look at important information about risk and health effects on health that is not given sufficiently by food groups, refined versus unprocessed grain carbohydrates, dietary fibre, pragmatic carbohydrate quality indices. When you think about the linkage of dietary fibre to total available carbohydrate, I'm just going to put something down, I think. So on number 2, I was talking about linkage of dietary fibre.
Well, let him go. Keep going, Geoffrey.
Carbohydrate. That is the carbohydrate fibre ratio. It's complicated. Sorry, you're interrupting. What do you want to say? And what I've come to is that the available carbohydrate intake affects health risk multitonally, it goes up or down, and dependent on health measures. We need to strive, I think, to propose a carbohydrate quality index that might be useful or not useful. It's very easy for us to get one that's not useful, and when we're doing that, we've got a waste of time and useless secondary to establishment of values. I'm seeing 2 screens at the moment. So it might be useful, but a waste of time and waste of money sometimes if we're just getting something which is not fully researched. Okay. And fourthly, there are advances in artificial intelligence which we may find useful in the future, especially in statistical aspects. So I'll move on to. Here we are. Well, traditionally, these are the sorts of food-based advice that we've had over the years. And the question is it optimal or not? Well, it's not optimal. And one reason is that it's not optimal is that it's not going to tell us very much about differences we can get in glycemic index of different diets or we have 2 which if after correcting for the impact of these foods on the glycemic index, we find that they follow a distribution which is very much similar, and it's really still quite wide. So we really do need the glycemic index in there to help us with our understanding of the relationship between carbohydrate and health. I should say in this that we're looking at the percentile of food within a food group. So for example, the legumes will also spread from the length because it's the percentile rather than the straight glycemic index. We often like to think of differences that are made by refined and minimally processed foods on GI and unrefined grain meals on GI. So this refined versus unrefined is not really being very helpful to us because the average values are only 15 differences apart. And we can see from the tails in this, there are lots of foods which are not consistent with just defining a single refined and unrefined basis for defining cereal foods or even other foods. So the refined and unrefined categories of cereal products do not indicate the range of GI that these products show. Consumer health professionals need to know this, I feel. Now, if you're developing a carbohydrate quality index, one thing that always comes up, of course, is dietary fiber, and all too often in the past, that is, glycemic index hasn't. Now, dietary fiber and glycemic index, as shown in this early study, early meta-analyses that were shown that the glycemic index and dietary fiber do differ consistently throughout the range of values that people can be eating. So there's not very much correlation between the two that we have to worry about. They add together to show us what the outcome would be here in patients with dietary fiber. Now, over recent years, there's been this move to a so-called, some people will call it a pragmatic carbohydrate quality index, and trying to relate it to glycemic index. There's quite a number. Everything in the box is the same, apart from that it's got several lines there, and to show the sort of way that the model is described, we can show these figures on the right-hand side here in this way. And what we need to do really is to establish whether in fact this is related to the glycemic index. And this very useful study, which was rather interesting because this one wasn't available to me until I put in a search at the Royal Society of Medicine among 34 different databases, and it came up with just one paper which described a pragmatic carbohydrate quality index. So it wasn't the best of starts, but we've gone further now with other, by just dropping off pragmatic. So what we've got is that we've just increased by changing in sugars. So all of these have got the same basic fiber carbohydrate ratio. And so it's important to know, it seems to me, that that if you're thinking you're dealing with fiber in this ratio, does carbohydrate become a determinant in itself, or is it a non-determinant? Well, not just fiber effects, but also does carbohydrate. I'll come to that later. What I'm going to do is talk about these various indices and agreement with the glycemic index of grain products. And this is the same paper and the same carbohydrate quality indices down here, listed here. And what we find is that when we try to use this, or when they try to use this system to list carbohydrates, to classify them as low GI, medium GI, and high GI, there was a high rate of misclassification at the high and low ends, and a very high misclassification there in the middle band. So really, it's not telling us much about the GI. And I'm pleased to have to see many of the more later CQIs are including glycemic index in there. So it's very important. Just to put that again, kappa is for statisticians. Kappa is a means of showing the extent of agreement, and it ranges from 1 in some foods, some grain foods, down to 0. And if we do a further analysis, simple analysis, we can find that the majority of foods, 144 out of the 244, has very poor classification. Very poor ability to classify them by GI. In fact, it doesn't at all. So now what about the carbohydrate? If we're looking at a carbohydrate to fiber ratio as one of our determinants, we might just be thinking that carbohydrate doesn't have a large effect. Well, that seems to be true for things like type 2 diabetes and and coronary heart disease. But for other conditions, it may not be true. And looking at a paper or recent papers on what this ratio is, what this risk ratio is for consuming carbohydrate in the various diseases, all mentioned here. We get type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, and unhealthy aging. And the reason I use that is that unhealthy aging wasn't the subject of in the publication. It was healthy eating, but if we invert it and reckon that there's a good approximation between odds ratios and risk ratios when the effects are not considerable, then we can see that in fact for unhealthy aging, carbohydrates are quite good at avoiding that. But the point is now, when it comes to the carbohydrate quality index, now we're interpreting the carbohydrate divided by fiber, knowing that some of that is actually due to carbohydrates and not due to the fiber. So now we have to think about all the other sorts of diseases that there are mentioned down this side, which are distinctly different from type 2 diabetes and coronary heart disease, and where fiber must be having a significant effect. Where available carbohydrate must be having a significant effect. Now, it's been mentioned earlier on that fiber isn't just fiber, it's made up of a number of different things. And to point this out, that if you're going to use a carbohydrate to total fiber ratio, you might not see very much going on. These are from Walter Willett's laboratory. Somewhere down here, on coronary heart disease. But yet, when it comes to sealed fiber, we do get substantial. In fact, it's 5 times higher effect, and it tends to be monotonic. So cereal fiber and the cereal fiber ratio here, carbohydrates not having much effect. So we've got a 20% difference there from one and a 20% difference there from one. Now these are pooled for men and women on both sides, and you get similar pictures in both men and women, both sides. What about carbohydrate quality index? Some have used this one, putting glycemic index in there for purposes of assessment on prospective cohort studies, and come to an index which ranges from 4 to 20. Study here on odds ratios, where the impact of the odds ratio to a higher GI or to a lower GI. In fact, the authors were comparing this one with these two, and the two are not comparable because they're expressed in a different way. To get them into the same expression, we need to divide the odds ratio there into 1 and come up with 0.4. So now we're not going to higher GI, we're going to lower GI. And what you can see here is that the effect on the odds ratio is very much greater than it is with the CQI. So again, it indicates that the glycemic index is a very important part of deciding what is the quality of the food carbohydrate. Now, it was mentioned earlier in discussions, are we able to sum together the various factors that are affecting the risk? And here I put some original data together from this publication here, and just showing what happens when you add them together, GI and one over the carb, and one, in other words, getting rid of the carbohydrate question there, over cereal fiber, and it becomes high, 1.36, higher than anything there individually. We can add the carbohydrate into that and get a slightly different value if we wanted to. And we get it for adding in the SSBs again, it would be higher. So it looks like there's every chance that we can do this. And you did speak earlier on, or a number of you spoke earlier on, that covariance is not a big problem in doing this. But I would say that we ought to be concerned still that there is with due care about the possibility of covariance and the effect that it would have on the total. And that it would be possible, in fact, well, it's not possible with these data, just summing the results from individual parts of studies to work out the covariances. But if you're working with the original data, then you can. And I would suggest that we do move away from just thinking about a carbohydrate quality index, and we do work out what each contribution is to that quality index. And if we wanted to have an index rather than individual ones, then we can add them together. But for nutrition purposes, it's going to be an awful lot better for any dietitian to be able to put together a diet based on the individual components than it is from a diet quality index. Here we have now the odds of lung cancer. Have we got this twice? Yes, I think we've had that one before. So the summary, only something to be aware of, really. Glycemic index adds important information about risk to health and effects of health that is not given sufficiently by food groups, refined versus unrefined grain carbohydrates, dietary fiber, or pragmatic carbohydrate quality indices. Linkage of dietary fiber to total available carbohydrate is complicated. Available carbohydrate intake affects health risk multitonically and health measures dependently. So it looks like you may well, for different health outcomes, need a different CQI. But there are some which might be similar. For example, you might have type 2 diabetes and coronary heart disease, and MET-S as being reactive to CQI as a single identity. We don't want to waste our time and money, and I've been provocative in saying that. It's wonderful that we have an awful lot of data from individuals, RCTs, and prospective cohort studies, but we now to look to the future and think about getting not just the carbohydrate quality indices, but to get the individual components of that and put them together into a CQI, if a CQI found a use. And my fifth point is, and it's already been mentioned in some applications, that advances in artificial intelligence and large health databases may resolve complications, but the theory statistical applications can already do this to a degree. So we don't have to wait for AI for doing, as I suggest, but in future we may well see just call up one AI and say we've got this data, we want it to do a certain analysis, and it would do it. It's a little way off yet in nutrition, but it could be possible. Finally, I want to end what I'm saying by thanking you all, listening with your ears and your eyes to see what I've got, and express my thanks again to all the sponsors of the meeting and to everyone's patience for listening to me after these difficulties. Thank you very much.